Hello, BookTube. I wasn't going to make one video today. I was just going to read to you a bit. I'm a little bit distracted, but Wednesday is the day for Epic Comic Book Wednesday, my years-long team up with Michael K Vaughan, where we talk about some comic book subject. And he came up with such a great subject this time around that I thought I'd make one more video, a comic book video, for the four of you who watch these things. The subject that he came up with here was if he or I were given complete control over the major superhero comic book industry in America, in other words, Marvel Comics and DC Comics, how could we fix it? The underlying assumption being that it needs fixing. I think that's amply true. I think that's obviously demonstrated, among other things, by Epic Comic Book Wednesday. As I've mentioned many times, Mike and I talk about all kinds of things on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, but we don't talk about the comics we bought that week because we don't buy comics. And neither do a huge number of people who grew up buying comics. They don't buy them at all anymore. Just a dead hobby. Uh, that is not a disturbance in the asteroid belt. That is not the rise of Bitcoin. That's the fault of the industry. An industry is doing something wrong if that happens. If it hasn't been superseded by anything else, by some other thing, it's no fault of cassette makers that CDs took off. But there's no alternate to comic books except maybe manga, which is doing sales hand over fist. So the American superhero comic book industry is certainly at fault. They must be. So what would you do to fix things? And I love this question, and I broke it. I have the iPad here. I broke it down into three categories, starting with personnel, because that's crucial. The crucial contention here, the crucial reason why the American comic book industry is hurting so bad, is because both major companies, Marvel and DC, I won't talk for the minute about the secondary companies, both major comic book companies have been completely ideologically captured. So from the editor-in-chief on down, they have been completely captured by an extremely savage, stupid, in this case far left ideology that is very punitive. It's very minatory. It watches what you do. It enforces conformity. It uses bribery and extortion and name calling and digital mobs and all that sort of stuff. And Marvel first and then DC have completely fallen to these ideologies. So if our first grouping of what I would do to fix things, to turn things around, before we talk about anything else, you have to fix that. Because every industry has a core audience. No matter what it is, every industry has a core audience. The people who aren't the core audience, the atmospheric audience, they can be moved. They come and go. A bad ad campaign will drive them away. Good ad campaign will bring them in. Something becomes a fad elsewhere outside of your industry but adjacent to it. You'll get a whole bunch of those people. But your core group will stay. And they're the ones who keep the lights on. They're the ones who pay the bills. And for the last 10 or 12 years, Marvel and DC Comics have been actively antagonizing their core audience. They've been actively saying that they want a different core audience, and that the reason they don't want the one they have is because the one they have is full of evil people. That would be me. That would be you if you've read comics for the last 40 years. That would be Michael K Vaughan. Evil people. And absolutely no changes can be made to fix this industry if any of those people remain. So, thing number one under the personnel heading is the most important thing to do here, which is to fire every far left activist, every so-called SJW, anywhere in your company. It's important to understand that these aren't really human beings. They have been hollowed out by social media. They're more like locusts. So you can't leave even one behind. You can't say, well, we got rid of all the editors who were SJW ideologues, but there's a kid down in the janitorial services. We don't have to fire him. You do. You have to fire every one of them and walk them out of the building. You must do a completely clean sweep. They'll be easy to identify. They'll have pronouns in their biography. They'll have Ukraine flags at their cubicle. They'll think that men can give birth to babies. It'll be easy to spot them. They won't deny what they are. It'll be easy to spot them. You have to get rid of them all of them. And then once you've done that, well, then you have to hire new people. You have to fill those ranks. That might be difficult to do if it turns out that when you get rid of the SJWs on your payroll, you're left with no one else. Then you might announce a publishing pause. to everybody. Say we're going to come back stronger than ever, but we're going to take the summer off, or a month off even. But then you have to hire new people, and you have to make sure that you don't correct ideological extremism on one end of the spectrum with ideological extremism on the other end of the spectrum. You don't want to hire Nazis. So you might need a hiring manager or a hiring management team. Shouldn't be too hard to do, I would think. I mean, organizations do this sort of thing all the time when they have rot. The key is, though, that the editors have to go as well. All the editors who are SJWs have to go. Everyone who is that in any way, in any capacity, an editor, a group editor, a sub-editor, a writer, an artist, an inker, colorist, they all have to go. Can't leave one, can't expect to give them small, low-profile assignments, can't expect them to keep their mouth shut, can't expect that the problem won't recur. It has to be scorched earth. You have to pull these things out by the root. But once you've done that, and once you've hired new people, well, then you've got a new workforce. You've got editors who are dedicated to comic books. You've got writers and artists who are dedicated to comic books. Then you need to reinstitute something. You do two things. One is old and one is new. You have to reinstitute the book. Forever and ever, for decades, at Marvel and Timely and Atlas and DC, there was a book, an editorial book. And you could not vary from the book. The book would tell you what you could and couldn't do. In broad strokes, you can exercise all the creativity in the world coming up with your stories, but the book would tell you things you couldn't do, given properties of your imaginative world. And you are not free. In the ye olden days, you were not free to violate that. In the last 10 or 12 years, it has been almost a job requirement for you to violate that. But you would have to reestablish the book. That's an old thing. And the new thing is that you would have to say to your new hires, your social media, all of your social media, your Blue Sky, your Facebook, your Twitter, your Instagram, you can keep that, but you have to swap it over to private. Your social media must be private. You are not allowed to have a public-facing social media that announces in any way that you are connected with this company. Any social media activity on the part of any editor, any group editor, any sub-editor, any writer, any artist, any colorist, any inker is a firing offense. The first time you do it, you're fired. You do not speak for this company in any way. We need social media to hype our books. We will hire an editor to do that, and he will hire someone if he needs help. But it won't be you. You don't do that. You don't do that. You do, you're fired. I believe myself that there's plenty of people out there. I don't think it would be hard to staff these companies. But it absolutely has to be from the top down, and it absolutely has to be ironclad. This is the thing that killed the industry. So this is the number one thing to fix. So that's personnel. And then we can go on to the marketplace, because there are a couple of things that need to change there as well. The main thing being that the tyranny of specialty shops needs to be broken right away. Right now, you cannot buy a comic book from Marvel or DC except in a comic book shop. About 1,000 of them in the country. That leaves a lot of people without any access to comics at all unless they buy them digitally, which kind of defeats the fun. So that needs to go. Specialty shops need to, they can stay, of course, you can still have comic shops, but comics need to be sold on specialty displays in bookstores. They need to be sold in spinner racks or specialty displays in every Costco, every Walmart, every Best Buy. They need to be everywhere. Everywhere that will take a concession on them, they need to be. Even in library vestibules, library book sales, Books A Million, every place that can have it. You need an aggressive outreach and marketing campaign to do that, and a marketing team that knows what to do. But again, such teams can be hired. DC Comics and Marvel Comics have billion-dollar cinematic properties behind them. They can afford the money to make this arm of their industry into a positive instead of a net loss. It's been a net loss for over a decade. So that's the number one thing that needs to happen, is that comic books need to be somewhere. I mean, it doesn't matter how good a product you're making if no one sees it. And right now, no one sees it. If you're lucky enough to have a comic shop near you, fine, you can buy comics, but most people aren't, and would if they did. If you had comics at your grocery store, a lot more comics would sell. So that's thing number one from the marketing perspective. And thing number two from a marketing perspective is that comics have to be cheaper. Right now, they're $5 or $6 a piece. That's ridiculous. That's not a hobby, especially if you're bringing out multiple comics every week. And the way to make them cheaper is fairly obvious. They need to stop being made with this weird polyurethane laminated archival worthy materials. That was spawned from the collector craze of the 1990s, and that collector craze is never coming back. Right now, comic books are incredibly expensive because they're incredibly expensive to make. Print them on paper and pulp, and price them at $3 a piece, and that's it. Don't even think about that price. Just don't even think about it. The key to turning around the economics of how much individual comics cost is not to increase the price by increasing the quality. Collectors are going to bag and board these things anyway. They're not going to touch them anyway. So whether or not these things are of archival quality is immaterial. Now, the key is to make them good so that people will buy them in numbers to offset. And that can be done. And how can that be done? Well, we'll move on to the comics themselves, which is the largest part of this video. And here I've just jotted down a whole bunch of ways to fix the comic book industry, starting with the biggest one of all, which is end all major comic book events. Not a moratorium, end them completely. So in the book, in the editorial book, is you will not have any events. Don't pitch them, because the answer is no. So no big corporate multi-tie-in thing that has toys and that has, it's about alien invasions, but every separate comic book in the lineup, the editors have been told, you've got to do a tie-in issue here. And you've got to make it important. Because we've got these readers over a barrel. They're going to want the whole story, and you're not going to get the whole story if the story is bouncing from one title to another and it goes to a title you don't like. So even though the story is about an alien invasion and you're running, let's say, DC's horror comic, House of Mystery or whatever, you still have to have aliens in the issue. And the editor can say, well, that doesn't fit with this comic at all. I can't link Man-Thing to an alien invasion. Hitherto, because of the success of one issue, one event, and one event only, Crisis on Infinite Earths, made money. That's it. None of the others have. But on the strength of that alone, so again, we're talking about the late 80s and the 90s, where the comic book industry is still hung over from a moment of success they had with Crisis on Infinite Earths and the collector boom. That's a long time ago. It's time to get over that. So the answer will be no. No more huge events. None at all. So that's thing number one. And thing number two flows out of thing number one, because the reason that events are so popular is because of Crisis on Infinite Earths, an event that DC Comics did in the 1980s in an attempt to, as they put it, simplify their continuity. That was a solution to something that was not a problem. Fans did not care about the continuity. Fans were interested in it. No one cared about simplifying it. DC Comics thought it was a problem and decided to simplify it. And that doesn't work. that doesn't work at all. It led to more confusion than any of the confusion that the writers were trying to fix. So thing number two from the comic book era from the comic book end of things is abruptly. We're not talking about an event here. We're not talking about a cosmic MacGuffin. You are to abruptly reset the continuity at Marvel and DC Comics to 1985. Across the board. And you're not explaining anything either. Just your core audience is men between the ages of 40 and 60. So they're just going to applaud. They're not going to ask for an explanation. Reset the continuity in the next issue. No, don't lead up to it. Don't make it any kind of the Spectre is having a bad day or anything. Just do it and don't explain it. Reset the continuity to 1985 in Marvel and DC and leave it there. Don't do anything else. I came up with two exceptions, two things that have changed in that time, since then, that I think most fans, 90% of fans, would want to keep. Because SJW lunatics have been in charge of these two companies, when the fans said we want to keep those things, both things were ruthlessly targeted by the editorship as things that fans couldn't have. If they said they want something, well, that's the thing they absolutely cannot have. And those two things are, in Marvel, the marriage of Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. 99.9% of fans want them to be married, and they aren't now. So you can have that MacGuffin at Marvel for this 1985 rule, and for DC it would be the Super Sons. A writer and artist team came up with a great idea of giving Superman and Lois Lane a son, and it was a gamble, but boy did it work. Fans were almost entirely universal in how much it works for Superman to be the dad of a little boy. Doesn't hurt the character at all. So you could keep that. You certainly have to keep that because you're getting rid of the aged up teenage super gay son of Superman. Instead, You can have Batman's son and Superman's son as the Super Sons, and that can be your exception. But otherwise, the continuity all goes back to 1985. Then the next item here is a moratorium rather than a ban. We have a ban on major events. A moratorium would be 5 years, let's say, maybe 10. No character deaths. No characters die. Bystanders, but no villains and especially no heroes. Nobody dies in comics. And since the continuity has been retroactively changed, that also fixes a lot of the nobody dies violations that have existed since then. You can keep the character of the Winter Soldier, but he's not Bucky. Bucky is dead. And of course, Jor-El is dead. Superman's father is dead. He did not survive the death of Krypton. So I want to say no characters die. And if we do a moratorium, if we say 5 years or 10 years, then at the end of that time, when the moratorium lifts, it has to be understood, it has to be written in the book, that if a character dies, their death is permanent. They're not coming back, no matter how much fans howl for it. So if you kill a character and all the press and fan reaction is negative, what's going to happen is not that you're going to come up with a tortured way to bring that character back. No, what's going to happen is that you're going to get fired. So be very careful with what you do. Then the next item here for fixing the comics would be cut back on multi-part stories. Maybe 2 parts, but no crossovers, no nothing like that. Cut back on those for at least 5 years. The idea being here that we're trying to draw readers in. We want to lure back our core audience, all of whom are gone. But we also want to draw in new readers. And new readers are not going to be drawn in by, Blood Rain Part 15. So you can continue a story to be continued, one issue to the next, but not a 15-part story about a virus infection in Gotham City. Not anything of the kind. Not for years. Then the next one is pragmatic. In addition to making the comics less expensive by making them cheaper build, we also want fewer comics. You don't have the audience anymore to sustain the gigantic output that you have. So let's say Marvel and DC each, maybe 15 comics a month, maybe 20. So you wouldn't have 5 Batman titles. You wouldn't have 5 X-Men titles. You wouldn't have 5 Spider-Man titles. No, not at all. Batman would have Batman and Detective Comics. Spider-Man would have The Amazing Spider-Man, and that's it. The Uncanny X-Men, that's it. Not anything else starting with the letter X, just the Uncanny X-Men. A small number, so that combined with the lower price tag, fans can now buy the whole of what you do in a month, as we all used to once upon a time. Then, along the same lines of bringing in new readers, cut back on supporting cast. And again, you don't need to bring in a mystical MacGuffin. Just start it in the next issue and don't explain it. Fans will applaud you. We don't need 15 characters called Superman. I think there are right now 13 different characters called Robin. No. All of that that garbage needs to be pruned away. The idea that if you come up with a character in a comic book, it is there forever is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. So get rid of all of those. Prune all of that. It should be the latest issue of Aquaman or the Justice League should be almost completely comprehensible to a brand new reader. Someone who's not only never picked up an issue of Justice League, but never picked up an issue of a comic book before. It should be pretty much comprehensible to them. And then the final note here, of course, is something that I was going to say anyway, which is that all of those 15 comics that each company comes out with has to be headlined by a hero. The SJW ideologues and zealots that have run the comic book side of the comic book companies for the last 10 or 15 years are horrible people. Now, some of their critics are horrible people too. The neck-bearded Nazis on YouTube are horrible people. But they aren't wrong in saying that these are horrible people. Bitter, lonely, frustrated, egomaniacal losers. And they have imported their worldview into superhero comic books. A huge amount of cynicism, a huge amount of nihilism. That all has to go. If you're headlining a comic book, you're doing it because you're a hero. So no Venom, no Carnage, no Joker, no nothing like that. No, you can't have a comic book that is headlined by a character who can kill people. return to heroism. I'm not saying that we have to return to no continuity and no verisimilitude, but at least that. Um, so anyway, those just another brief video to distract me. This was just too good a discussion. I'd love to know what, if the four of you who are watching, I'd love to know what your remedies would be. Do you agree? I gave this some thought. I think I've diagnosed what's wrong with the industry. Do you agree with any of this? Is there anything you would add? Uh, I imagine that some of you longtime comic book fans would add some more exceptions to my 1985 rule. It wouldn't just be uh, Peter Parker marries Mary Jane and the Super Sons. You'd probably add a couple of other things too, but I'd love to hear what they are. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.